Journalist Mark Stryker joins us from Detroit to talk about the fascinating history of jazz in his hometown. He'll also be showing us some vinyl from his collection of more than 6,000 records. Plus, it's Throwback Thursday. We'll be taking some looks at some classic Jazziz magazine covers. I'm Ryan Zimmerman. Welcome to the Jazziz Happy Hour. All right, and welcome to the show, everyone. You know, I have no doubt that many of you out there in Facebook world or YouTube world have been tagged for this name 10 albums or name 20 albums challenge that's going around the internet. It just as you post like 20 album covers, no explanation, right? No commentary, just the album cover, and it's supposed to represent some moment in your life. Well, my turn has finally come. I have been nominated by someone to share my 20 album covers, and I'm a little nervous about it, frankly, because it's not that I'm ashamed of my musical taste, but hey, we all went through junior high school. We all went through our awkward musical phases, and I just hope my guilty pleasures don't shock my family and friends. So I'm going to be sharing those on my Facebook page, and maybe I'll cross-post them on the Jazziz Facebook page as well. Let me know if you, in the comments, if you think that's a good idea. If you'd be interested in hearing some of the Jazziz editors, 10 albums or 20 albums that influence them. Anyway, before we get into the nitty-gritty of today's show, I want to let you know about some albums from the ECM label that I think you might really like. We'll start with one. We'll start with a new album by Carla Bley, Andy Shepard, and Steve Swallow. It's a trio that actually celebrates its 25th year together. The name of the new album is Life Goes On. It consists of three just absolutely stunning suites, and of course some beautiful improvisation from this group, as you'd come to expect. There are a few trios in jazz that really know how to communicate like this one. It is available for streaming and purchase now, and if you've never owned an ECM album on CD, it is a thing of beauty, so go pick yourself up a copy. To learn more, visit ecmrecords.com. All right, my guest today is Mark Stryker, a fabulous writer and scholar of jazz. He was a jazz, classical music, and visual arts critic for the Detroit Free Press from 1995 to 2016, and he literally wrote the book on jazz in the Motor City. Yes, literally. His book, Jazz from Detroit, was published in July of 2019, and was just named Book of the Year by the Jazz Journalists Association. He is here to walk us through the timeline of jazz history in Detroit. So please welcome to the show, waiting in the wings, Mr. Mark Stryker.
Hey, Brian. Nice to see you. Nice to be here. Thanks so much.
Good to see you too, man. And congratulations, Mazel Tov, on your book being named Book of the Year by the Jazz Journalists Association. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's well, first of all, it's always great to be recognized for by your peers. And for me, it's especially gratifying to have the spotlight shine brightly on Detroit, which is a city that's so important to America, so important to American music, and in particular important to jazz. So that's what really has gotten me excited. We've gotten a lot of attention to the book, sold a lot of copies, and I think people are getting to hear the story of Detroit.
Totally. And we have the cover up, but Jeff, you can pull up the cover. This is what it looks like, available now. Mark, are you a native? Are you a Michigander?
Not originally from Bloomington, Indiana, where I grew up. But I came to Detroit in 1995 to work for the Detroit Free Press, and I've been here ever since. And of course, I consider myself a Detroiter. It's when I came here, like many people, I grew up reading liner notes, and I would see, oh, Donald Byrd, he's from Detroit. Oh, Joe Henderson was from Detroit. Oh, the Jones brothers. But it wasn't until I got here that I really began to understand how deep the tradition ran, how many musicians came through here, and how and why this city has been so special. So no, I'm not originally from here, but I now consider it my hometown.
Cool, man. Yeah, we will get into all those amazing artists to come out of Detroit. And people, of course, people know the amazing musical legacy that is Detroit, Motown music, soul. But, as your book so eloquently lays out, it is also a hotbed for jazz music. I'm curious, people even kind of casually aware of the history of jazz kind of know of this migration from New Orleans, where it originated, kind of up through Chicago and over to New York. But when did the jazz scene in Detroit really first take root? Who were some of those seminal figures early on, or some of those seminal venues?
Well, so jazz and Detroit sort of grow up together, actually, in the 20th century. And what happens is in the first half of the 20th century, including starting in the 1910s and 1920s, the Great Migration brings hundreds of thousands of African Americans to the North in search of better economic opportunity, less overt racism, and the auto industry in Detroit, which gets going in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, begins to provide some of the most the best paying jobs for African Americans in the country. And so Detroit is really on the leading edge of creating a Black working and middle class in this country. And so by the 1920s, as jazz is coming of age all over the country, right, we begin to become a center by the late 1920s in the city. And for instance, Don Redman comes from New York to Detroit to lead McKinney's Cotton Pickers, that band, that unfortunately named band, in Detroit in the late 1920s. And that's a seminal big band in the history of the music in terms of Don Redman codifying the sound of big band jazz. And at the same right time in Detroit in the late 1920s, the best known white band in America is being led by now the name is floating out of my head. It will come to me in a moment. But both Bix Beiderbecke and Frankie Trumbauer here in Detroit for a few minutes in the late 1920s, right, working with the Jean Goldcat band. So even by the late 1920s, Detroit is becoming to be an important place for jazz. It's a crossroads. All the touring ensembles come here through the 1930s. And it's really then in the late 1930s and early 1940s and mid 1940s where jazz becomes really central to the Detroit story and becomes central then to the American story of this music.
Right. And that was my question. It wasn't just that this was an incubator for talent, and that the players would start in Detroit and then go elsewhere, like some other cities were. There was very much a scene there too.
Yes. What you have to remember is that by the 1940s, Detroit is the fourth or fifth, depending on what year you're talking about, largest city in the country. And in 1950, our population peaks at nearly 2 million people. About 17% of those, 300 to 350,000 of those folks are African Americans. So Detroit is like, the auto industry is roaring. And what you have in Detroit is this confluence of several cultural, economic, political factors, social factors that create this explosion of jazz in the middle of the 20th century. And those have to do with, as I said, the auto industry attracting people from the South, the Great Migration. That creates this Black working and middle class in the city. That creates nightlife, African-American nightlife, which is to say dozens and dozens and dozens of bars, restaurants, hotels, clubs where music is happening starting in the 1930s and peaking in the 1940s and 50s into the early 60s. And on top of that, you have the Detroit public schools have a reputation as one of the great public school music education programs in the country. And that is flourishing in the 1930s and 40s. And that seeds the scene here in a really profound way. And you have at the same time the development of really essential mentors in the community. So now we're talking about people in the 1950s. We're talking particularly about Barry Harris, the great pianist who trains Paul Chambers and Doug Watkins and Curtis Fuller and Donald Byrd and Charles McPherson and Roy Brooks. And it's a huge list. Every important musician, Pepper Adams, every important musician that comes out of Detroit in the 1950s kind of goes through the academy of Barry Harris. So when you think about this thriving nightlife that is, and hey, there's Barry.
There he is, the young Barry Harris. Yeah.
In 1955, about at a place called the World Stage in Detroit. That's a drummer who's still alive here in Detroit named Rudy Tusich. And the musician to the left is Bernard McKinney, better known today as Kiani Zawadi, rather, who plays baritone horn. Is the great euphonium player on Freddie Hubbard's Ready for Freddie, for instance.
Okay.
So you see this combination of this thriving nightlife, the great public schools where kids are learning how to play their instruments formally in the European tradition, mixed with the great mentorship from people like Barry Harris, and an opportunity then to put into practice what you're learning at night on the scene. That creates this extraordinary explosion in the middle of the 20th century. There are other factors too. We have great audiences here. We have there's a small town nurturing quality here, big city competition, but small town nurturing. And standards here were very high. You know, Pepper Adams used to say that he didn't realize, he thought that everybody played with good time, good rhythm, good time, because everybody in Detroit played that way. It wasn't until Pepper left Detroit that he began to understand that not everybody played with as good a time as they did in Detroit. So
where do you think that comes from, Mark? It's something about the musical cultural tradition of when you think of Detroit. God, I mean, there's an amazing gospel tradition, amazing blues tradition. You know, you think about the things that led to the creation of Motown. Was there something in the water? You could literally listen to a player from Detroit and say, that cat's from Detroit. He's got it. She's got it.
I think in terms of jazz, I think Barry Harris, I think there are a couple of answers to your question. Mm-hmm. One of which is that Barry Harris instilled the kind of polished discipline and craftsmanship in Detroit that has an allegiance to the bebop tradition that still is very important to Detroit musicians. Mm. You have to be able to play the blues and you have to be able to swing if you're from Detroit, when you come through Detroit. And so that's a cultural thing that has been accumulated over the decades, and I think Barry has something to do with it. But I think we need to go back to the public schools and to this idea of the training. Now, just for a moment, let me say here, elementary school students started playing instruments in the 3rd grade. There were specialists in the elementary school by the 5th and 6th grade. And we had high schools like Cass Tech, which produced Paul Chambers, Doug Watkins, Ron Carter, Julius Watkins, Alice Coltrane, Roland Hanna. Howard McGee, Lucky Thompson. All these people came through Cass Tech. Gerald Wilson all came through Cass Tech, which was like an arts magnet school, basically. You were getting high-level, college-level music education. Half your day was spent taking high-level theory, history. If you played a wind instrument, you had to study piano. If you played a string instrument, you had to study a woodwind instrument. So like Ron Carter, who played cello and bass in the school orchestra, also played alto clarinet in the top concert band at Cass Tech. Gerald Wilson told me he learned everything he needed to know at Cass Tech about harmony. Band leaders like Jimmy Lunsford, Ellington, Basie, when they would come and play in Paradise Valley in Detroit, they would, during the day, they'd always go over to Cass Tech to check out the young talent.
And where did these high standards come from? Was it, Europeans migrating to the city and kind of bringing those classical traditions with them, or
part of it is that, but part of it is that music education, quality music education, was seen as an essential rite of educational passage, and African American parents as well as white parents demanded it. And the schools in Detroit were integrated by law as early by the early 20th century. And so what that meant was that even though there were housing discrimination and other social forces that were pushing towards sort of wider segregation, it still meant that African American kids got opportunities that for great music education at all the best high schools in the same way that the white kids did. So, these high standards and this ability to really play their instrument well really pays off in a lot of interesting ways. For instance, Detroit becomes a real center for bebop very quickly. We're one of the first cities to adapt the new music coming from the East Coast, the music of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk, all of this. And one of the reasons for that is that because our kids in Detroit played their instruments so well and they understood harmony, they had the skills to pick up on these new advanced concepts that were sort of blowing in from the East. Cool. So Howard McGee, Lucky Thompson, Al McKibben, Kenny Milt Jackson, all of these people who become very important musicians in the first generation of bebop, Gerald Wilson, they come from Detroit. And they're picking up these ideas very quickly because it's part of the educational milieu in the city.
They have the technical facility. Yeah, that's awesome.
Correct.
That's awesome. I'm curious about the kind of hybridity too of the scene. If some of the jazz players there were, involved in the growth of Motown, or the blues scene there, or the gospel scene there, down the line, the techno, the house scene, any of that, was there a lot of collaboration, or were the streams relatively separate?
Well, of course, in the middle of the 20th century, the lines between jazz, rhythm and blues, the R&B in those days, gospel, all the streams of African-American vernacular music were, the lines between them, the borders, let's say, were much more porous than they are today. So, if you were Milt Jackson, you were growing up in the church, right? In the sanctified church. I mean, Milt's ability to play the blues comes out of the church.
Right.
And that is the same, a lot, Roland Hanna came out of a lot of musicians came out of the church. So you have that. And, you had people like Kenny Burrell and Yusef Lateef are all involved in sort of what we would think of as kind of jump band blues, right?
Yeah.
The rhythm was still more shuffling and swinging than it was the even eighth note, say, of rock and roll. But it's leading in that direction, and all those guys were part of that. And then, Berry Gordy, who starts Motown Records, was a high school classmate of Barry Harris's, and Berry Gordy played boogie woogie piano, and of course many of the musicians that played at Motown, in fact, were jazz musicians, and Motown. I mean, Marcus Belgrave, the great trumpet player, who becomes a key mentor in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and beyond in terms of mentoring and bringing up kids like Jerry Allen and Kenny Garrett and Bob Hurst and Regina Carter. There's Marcus, and Kareem Riggins and Gerald Cleaver. I mean, I have a whole section in my book that's called Marcus Belgrave and His Children being all of these players that he mentored. Marcus comes to Detroit in 1963. He's not a native of Detroit, but he lands in Detroit in 1963 because of two reasons. One of which is that he knows his heroes, Thad Jones and Donald Byrd, are all from Detroit, and he wants to go where they came from. And he also comes here because he knows Motown is here, and he knows that he's getting off the road after years with Ray Charles, and he wants to go somewhere where he thinks he can get work, and he knows he can get work in the Motown studios. So he does. So there is some of that cross-pollination that happens, but we should always remember that before Motown existed, Detroit jazz was helping to change the shape of American culture. And after Motown left Detroit in the early 70s and has sort of disappeared, Detroit jazz continues to help shape the sounds of American culture. So jazz was here before and was here after. And then when they were here together, there was a synergy, of course.
Beautiful thing, man. How about this for cross hybridization? You saw the comment that our producer put up on the screen for a second there. Joe Coughlin says he learned about jazz at a very early age by watching Lunch with Soupy Sales on WXYZ TV in Detroit. Was that an outlet for, I'm a little before my time, admittedly, but was that a serious outlet for jazz back in the day?
It was, and it's a reminder in many American cities the important role that the media played, the electronic media, radio in those days, and television, local television, and in Soupy Sales started his career, his television career in Detroit, and starting in 1953 through 1960, he had two shows. He had a noontime show for kids. And then he had a late night show that was called Soupy's On. And Soupy Sales was a big jazz fan. He used to hang out in the clubs. He knew the musicians. He was great friends with them. And he had jazz on almost every night. And so through the early and middle and late 50s, Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, Errol Garner, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, you go down the list, every important, Chet Baker, every important jazz musician, Miles Davis, all played regularly on the Soupy Sales show. The very famous film that we have of Clifford Brown playing, the only film we have of Clifford playing, that comes from Soupy's show.
Okay, right.
And he was in town to play with Max Roach, and went over to play with Soupy's house band. And, unfortunately, none of those shows it was all live television. So nothing was on tape. And only a few of those shows got kinescoped, that is saved, a film version of a film of the TV screen. And only a few got saved. And only one of them had any jazz musician of note on it, and that was this film of Clifford Brown. But it comes from a Soupy show. And of course, all the Detroiters were on: Kenny Burrell, Tommy Flanagan, Barry Harris, Pepper Adams, Elvin Jones. They all were on Soupy's show at one time or another.
Wow. Well, so thanks for the stroll down memory lane, Joe. Thank you for the comment.
Yeah.
And, Mark, we're dropping names here and there, and we're going to get into the full roster of, Detroit jazz artists you should know in a minute. But I'm curious also about the club scenes, a lot of famous venues in Detroit, historically and today. What were some of the hot spots for jazz back in the day?
Well, for the modern jazz scene in the 1950s, the two really, well, there were two, there were so many places, but the real heartbeat of the center of the scene was the Bluebird Inn, which was on, the address was 5021 Tireman on the near west side of Detroit. It was a neighborhood bar, and sort of with banquettes and a raised bandstand and a clientele of mostly African American folks, but also whites from all over the city who were interested in modern jazz, and musicians and neighborhood folks. And Barry Harris lived right around the corner. Charles McPherson and Lonnie Hilliard, the trumpet player, Charles the great saxophone player, were kids living in the neighborhood. And the house band at the Bluebird, starting in 1953, was led by Billy Mitchell, saxophone, 52 rather, was a saxophone player, Billy Mitchell, with Thad Jones. And his brother Elvin played drums. The bass player was a cat named Beans Richardson. And the piano player at first was Terry Pollard, a woman who played vibes as well, and who left town in 53 to go with Terry Gibbs. And she was replaced by Tommy Flanagan. And when Tommy Flanagan left the house band, he was replaced by Barry Harris. When Thad and Billy Mitchell left, they had to go with Basie, and he was replaced by Pepper Adams. And that house band, they would also welcome guests. So Sonny Stitt would play with them. Miles Davis, we should remember, lived in Detroit for about 7 months in 1953, 54, as he was kicking his his drug habit.
Right.
And so Miles would hang out at the Bluebird and would sit in and would play. And there are stories of Miles Roland Hanna tells a story about Miles sort of watching Thad Jones play and with tears coming down out of his eyes because Thad played so creatively and inventively. And, Miles, when he gets back to New York, he records, 1955, he records one of Thad's tunes called Itty Bitty, which was a tune that was that he heard Thad play at the Bluebird. That band with Thad and Billy Mitchell made 4 sides for a Detroit-based label called DG Records, and those records have been later have been reissued, and that's the earliest version we have of Elvin playing. It's and you can hear the quality level, how high the standards are. I mean, that band sounds as good as any of the bands playing in New York at that time. So the Bluebird was a real centerpiece. But, we had, I would just mention one other place, the Minor Key, I'm sorry, not the Minor Key, but Klein Show Bar was a place where Yusef Lateef began to work in 1956. And from 1956 to 1959, Yusef had held down a 5-6 night a week gig there, playing every night. With that band included people like Louis Hayes and Curtis Fuller. It was Louis Hayes' first gig as a teenager. Louis Hayes leaves Detroit in 1957, going right from 1956, rather, going right from Yusef Lateef's band to Horace Silver's band. When Horace needed a drummer, and Horace's bass player at the time was Doug Watkins, and Doug was from Detroit. And Doug said to Horace, "Hey, get the baby boy out of Detroit." And so they hired Louis Hayes. So he comes out of Yusef Lateef's band, and Yusef Lateef's band, when he begins to record for Savoy and other labels in 1957, essentially that band piles in a car on Saturday night after their gig. They drive all night to New York. They record for a couple of days at Rudy Van Gelder's studio, and then they come back to Detroit and take up their gig again at Klein. So, wow. The scene was so vibrant here that people didn't have to leave necessarily to work all the time. Now, lots of folks did leave and they got famous, but somebody like Barry Harris, let's say, Barry stays in Detroit all the way from until he leaves to go with Cannonball Adderley, basically in 1960. And because Barry stays in Detroit so long, because there's work here for him to stay, he's able to train generation after generation of musicians, and so that sort of magnifies his influence, right? So it's all really happening here in Detroit in those days.
Absolutely, man. It sure sounds like it. And like I mentioned, I do want to get into some of the musicians, some of the essential cuts for people, listening to these amazing stories and go, okay, I want to hear some Detroit jazz. Jeff, our producer, had gone up and pulled up this Spotify playlist that you have put together. Quite a few songs on this thing. That will, this is your primer on
right.
On Detroit jazz. And I understand you have gone and pulled some selections from your own LP collection. Mark, is it true? Is this number true? 6,000 records, man?
That is a true number. It's actually probably more than 6,000.
Wow.
And in fact, one of the real drags about this pandemic is I'm like, like an addict, like I haven't been able to go to a record store in a long time. This is a long time. This is the longest time as an adult. I have not heard live music, and the longest time as an adult, I have not bought records. But yeah, I have about 6,000 LPs, and I pulled some. I will bring them out. You'll have to excuse me as I.
Man. We love when you show off the vinyl, man. So
as I move through here, let's just show this. Can everybody see the Kenny Burrell Midnight Blue?
Oh yeah,
right. Classic, 1963. Okay. A point I want to make about, and by the way, these are all original pressings for your vinyl geeks out there that are watching. Without Blue Note Records, without Detroit, Blue Note Records would have probably folded up shop in the late 50s and early 60s. One of the things that is about Detroit is that you can't pick up a record that was made on the East Coast between 1955 and say 1970 and not run into 1, 2, 3, 4 or more Detroiters, right? So That's one good example. You know, Tommy Flanagan, the great pianist, overseas.
Nice.
And you know, this was Elvin Jones on drums and Wilbur Little on bass. So Elvin, of course, and Tommy were friends as kids
Sure.
in Detroit, and they maintained a relationship all through their lives. I mean, one of Tommy's best records from the 1970s is called Eclipso. That's and Elvin plays drums on that. Speaking of the Jones brothers, Hank Jones. Have you met Miss Jones? Have you met Hank Jones, rather, on Savoy? One of the most elegant, beautiful solo piano records ever made.
Absolutely. In terms of solo piano, Hank Jones might be at the very top for me. Nobody has a touch quite like Hank, and maybe that's a Detroit thing. That's what I'm learning now.
Well, you know, no question. I mean, let's think of just quick digression. Let's talk about the four great post-war jazz pianists from Detroit: Hank Jones, Tommy Flanagan, Barry Harris, and Roland Hanna. You know, Hank has this beautiful lyrical touch. He's, you know, let's remember Hank comes to New York. He's fully formed as a musician even before bebop. So, you know, Teddy Wilson and Tatum are Hank's guys.
Yeah.
And then he sort of adapts the new language of Bud Powell and Charlie Parker in the middle 40s. But he's really he comes from an earlier era, and that elegance, you know, definitely reveals itself, Hank's influence in Tommy's playing. And Tommy was Roland Hanna's first big influence. Barry is a little bit different. Barry has a kind of a rhythmic, Barry's a bebop musician, right? He comes right out of Bud Powell. So there's a different kind of rhythmic flair and attack in Barry's playing. But Tommy Flanagan, Barry Harris, Alice McLeod Coltrane, and Kurt Lightsey all had the same childhood piano teacher here, a woman named Gladys Dillard, who was a very important person in the African American community here in Detroit. So, and as long as we're talking about pianists, let's remember that this legacy that we're talking about doesn't end in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, in terms of pianists, let's talk about, you know, the great Jerry Allen,
Sure.
Who unfortunately passed away a couple years ago at the age of 60, far too young. But Jerry is a Detroiter too. Jerry comes from Cass Tech, the same high school that I was talking about earlier. Jerry came through Cass Tech in the 1970s. She's also one of all of these musicians who come up under Marcus Belgrave. Another one that comes up under Marcus Belgrave is Kenny Burrell. This is Kenny Garrett, rather.
Yeah.
This is Kenny Garrett's debut LP on the Crisscross label from 1984, late 1984.
And Kenny is still doing this. Mark, we are right up on the time limit, unfortunately. I wish we could go through every one of your 6,000 records.
Of course.
But if we had to end, you could end on a high note. What, you know, one more we should definitely add to our collection of Detroit jazz. What album you want to show to us to wrap things up?
Let us, I tell you, I'm going to show Joe Henderson's Inner Urge, which has Elvin Jones on it, and Bob Cranshaw and McCoy Tyner from 1964. This is, for me, a Desert Island record. Joe Henderson was not born in Detroit. He's from nearby Lima, Ohio, but he comes to the city in 1956 to study at Wayne State. He also studies informally with Barry Harris. And between 1956 and 1960, Joe Henderson really gets his footing and develops his identity here as a Detroit musician, and really is one of the great heroes of the city for me and for many. So we'll end with Joe.
Right on, man. End with Joe. That's a hell of a way to end. Mark, if people want to buy the book, if they're interested in learning more, what's the best place to do that? We mentioned the book is out now.
Well, I tell you, I mean, obviously you can go to any online retailer and you can go to Amazon, you can do it that way. What I would dearly love for people to do is to call up their favorite local bookstore, independent store, which everybody's struggling, and order the book through them. It's the best thing you can do for culture in your city is to help support the local store. If you have to go online, feel free to do Amazon, but if you can, I'd recommend going through a local bookstore, and I appreciate the sale.
Well said, man. Hey, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us today, about jazz in Detroit. The Detroit Jazz Festival looks like it is happening in some way or another in September, virtually, or, we'll see. We'll just see what happens. That's something we're all kind of looking forward to, a light at the end of the tunnel for us jazz fans. We get to hear festival music again. Mark, this was an absolute pleasure, man. Again, the book Jazz from Detroit is out right now. Go read it, go buy it. It's excellent.
Thanks so much. I look forward to doing this again sometime. Likewise,
man. Take care, Mark.
Okay.
Have a good one. All right, Mark Stryker, everyone, joining us from Detroit to talk about the fascinating history of his hometown. And he said himself, you cannot tell the story of jazz in America without telling the story of jazz in Detroit. That playlist that we showed with all those Detroit musicians on there is going to be on our website when we post this video to our site, so you can stream it there as well. But it's also on Spotify, on Apple, everywhere you listen to your playlists. I want to take a quick break to just thank one more sponsor. That would be Bluesound. They're an award-winning wireless high-res sound system that lets you play music in any and every room throughout your home. You choose music from your favorite streaming service or from a music library connected to your home network. You control where, at what volume, and when music plays with a free BlueOS app for your smartphone, tablet, or desktop computer, and that's it. Getting the kind of crisp audio file grade system that every jazz fan deserves has never been easier. You can learn more at bluesound.com or by checking out our website, jazziz.com, where we have put together a Bluesound buyer's guide. All right, we're going to move into a new segment right now called The 5 Spot, and I hope you'll stick around for it. This is where I just share with you 5 things I'm digging at the moment. Could be new music, new live stream events, playlists, food, drinks, whatever. We took the name from this 5 Spot Cafe, which was obviously this iconic jazz club in New York. I never had the privilege of going to it because it closed in 1967, a little bit before my time. But people watching, if you have memories of the 5 Spot, I would love to hear them. Drop us a line in the comments. Let me know if you've ever been and what it was like. So the first thing I want to talk about is this Wayne Shorter benefit concert that is taking place through SF Jazz in San Francisco. SF Jazz is a concert venue in San Francisco. They've announced a historic Wayne Shorter celebration concert series with, you got to check out this lineup: Herbie Hancock, Kamasi Washington, Branford Marsalis, Terrence Blanchard, Terrace Martin, Danilo Perez, John Patitucci, Brian Blade, and more to be announced. This thing is going to be broadcast for the first time ever through SF Jazz Fridays at 5 series. These 4-night broadcasts, all contributions, they have a virtual tip jar, will go to the Wayne Shorter Fund and his ongoing medical needs. Now, I don't need to tell you that Wayne Shorter is a jazz legend in every sense of the word. And if there's an opportunity to help out Wayne, we should all jump on it. I mentioned it's part of the Fridays at 5 series. It's an online membership program launched in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a membership base, so you pay $5 a month or $60 a year, and you get, intimate concerts at, SF Jazz, including this one, in tribute to Wayne Shorter. So the events are taking place. Let's see. There's one Friday, May 22nd. That's tomorrow. One June 26th. One Friday, July 31st. And one more to be announced. All right. Number 2. Pardon our technical facility here. Number 2 on the 5 Spot list. It's from our own site. It is a new song by Maceo Parker. Yes. Maceo Parker, an alto saxophonist with this incredible funk and soul pedigree. You know him from his work with Parliament Funkadelic. You know him from his work with James Brown. I Got You. No. That saxophone solo. That's Maceo, man. That is Maceo Parker. His new song is Hard Times. It is the first single from his first studio album in 8 years, Soul Food, Cooking with Maceo. That's the name of the album, which will be released June 26th via the Funk Garage Mascot label. The song was composed by the saxophonist Maceo and Ray Charles collaborator David Fathead Newman. Again, this is up on our site right now. You can go, it's a premiere, it's an exclusive. You can go listen to this brand new Maceo Parker song right after this podcast. Number 3 on my 5 Spot list is these new concert series from Blue Note Club in New York. It's one of the great jazz clubs in New York City. I try to make a stop there whenever I'm in town. The last time I was there, I saw Talib Kweli, the rapper, was doing this really funky jazz set there with a jazz band backing him. It was awesome. Anyway, they are presenting a weekly concert series presented by the club and streaming right now. They have featured artists already such as Bob James, Monty Alexander, Nicholas Payton, Isaiah Sharkey, and they're putting up like 3 concerts per day. It's awesome. You should check out the lineup for this one. Today's concert, Ron Carter solo bass at 6 p.m., Chick Corea solo piano at 8 p.m., Harold Lopez Nusa live from Havana, Cuba at 10 p.m. I mean, this is awesome stuff. So check it out at the Blue Note New York Facebook page. Again, this is Blue Note, the club, these live from home series. These are the artists playing at their home, doing their best to kind of put on a jazz club set from home. I've been digging them. Number 4 on our 5-spot list. This is another homegrown one. It is our Bob James playlist. Now, as some of you might remember, we interviewed Bob on this very show back when it was the Jazziz Brunch in April. And our cover story in the May digital issue is all about Bob James and his impact on music, and, contemporary jazz, but really all jazz. This playlist was put together by our publisher, Michael Fagan, longtime Bob James fan and friend. It covers his early stuff. It covers his stuff with foreplay and everything in between. If you're into Bob James, you're going to want to check out this playlist. You will need a digital subscription to access this story. And don't worry, we're offering one right now for just 99 cents per month for 3 months. Anyway, next on the list is number 5, the 5th spot in the 5 spot. It's this new book by Chick Corea. Well, it's not a new book. It's his classic, A Work in Progress. He wrote it, I think, back in 2002. It's kind of Chick's letter to a young musician, type book. It's a tome for jazz students. He was answering classic questions that every jazz musician wants to know. How much time and effort should go into a single practice session? What can one do about a difficult audience? What's the best way to evaluate one's own live performances? How can I gain the ability to completely originate my own music? Chick Corea has gone through and revised this book. I've been seeing ads for this thing all over Facebook. Maybe Facebook knows that I'm a hack piano player, but if I can learn from anyone, it would be the master, Chick Corea. So definitely going to want to check this one out. That does it for our 5 spot, but I want to stay on the subject of Chick Corea for a little while. It is Thursday. In social media parlance, that means it is Throwback Thursday. And I wanted to throw it back to let's see what issue is, the March 1992 issue of Jazziz with Chick and Bobby McFerrin on the cover. 1992, folks, that is 28 years ago. Doesn't seem like it, but it really is. A young Chick and a young Bobby McFerrin, man, their duets are just magic. The trio stuff they did with Bella Fleck is just magic. And this is kind of a nice reminder of Chick in the heyday with a nice looking head of hair too, I might say. Although he hasn't lost a single strand, it seems, even though I have. Not fair, Chick. Our other Throwback Thursday cover is this one right here. Let's see if this one pops up. This is from the May 1986 issue. Back, I guess, would have been our second year of Jazz's existence. There's our old logo. That's Chick on the cover with the keytar around his neck. Let us know in the comments if you remember those days, folks. Those Chick Corea keytar shoulder pad jacket days. Anyway, that does it for Throwback Thursday, and that does it for our show as well. Thank you to Mark Stryker for joining me. Hey, I want to let you know again about the special offer going on right now, where for just 99 cents per month for 3 months, you can unlock complete digital access to our website. We have all kinds of features, interviews, Q&As, reviews that are for subscribers only. For just 99 cents for 3 months, you unlock all that content. Plus, we will enroll you to receive our summer 2020 issue, which comes out in June. And it also features Chick Corea. You get the theme here. It is an issue all about fusion music, that 70s heyday of fusion. We have a wide-ranging interview with Chick in there. Plus, we talk to some young musicians who are keeping the fusion flame alive. That's coming out in June. And if you subscribe, like I said, right now, for just 99 cents per month for 3 months, you'll get unlimited digital access. Plus, you'll be enrolled to receive that print issue when it comes out next month now. Also, independent artists I get asked a lot of times, hey, I just released an album. How can I get it in front of you? How can I get it in front of you? So I send it to you, or put in the mail. Do people even check mail anymore? I don't know. This is the answer. Our Inside Track program. Simply go to jazziz.com and click submit your music. You'll be taken to our Inside Track page. You can fill out everything about your album, your band name, the album name, the personnel, the track listing. You could send us a link to SoundCloud or Bandcamp. It comes to my inbox. It comes to online editor Matt McCucci's inbox. It comes to all of our inboxes, and I promise you, we listen to all this music. Not only that, but we post this music on the website so that curious listeners out there can listen to the music. You want to listen to a new, jazz fusion band from Siberia? We've got it. Piano trio from Tokyo? We've got it. It's a great place to kind of explore the global world of jazz. But independent artists and friends of independent artists, I highly suggest you check out our Inside Track program. Quick programming note. Tomorrow night, we'll be wrapping up the week with vocalist Linda Pearl. She's got a new album out right now. You may not know the name Linda Pearl, but you certainly know her as an actress. She portrayed Fonzie's girlfriend in Happy Days. And for you Office fans, myself included, she was Pam's mom / Steve Carell's girlfriend in The Office. So she's going to be on the show tomorrow to talk about her new project. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I am Brian Zimmerman. This has been the Jazziz Happy Hour. So long.